Welcome to Political Fictions, a podcast that didn't know a general election had been called because it hadn't been checking CFAX. My name's Cory Hazelhurst, and I'm joined by someone who's very annoyed because he's prepared a set of cue cards for this episode that I haven't bothered to use. It's Mark Pack. Hello, Mark.
Hello, Cory, but I'll get revenge with extra door content in this episode. Don't you worry.
Oh, thank heavens for that. I was a bit worried. Also joining us is someone for whom Shakespeare and the Bible are his texts, and I just wish he'd ignore his advisors and speak directly from the heart. It's John Cotton. Hello, John.
Hello. Hi, Cory. Hi, Mark. Great to be here.
Thank you for joining us. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm a recovering politician. I was up until May the leader of Birmingham City Council. You may have noticed it was a very quiet period when I was in charge, and not much interest happened there. And I'm now being released into the wild and able to contribute to podcasts again. So really great to be here this afternoon.
And in a break to our scheduled programming, we're recording an emergency podcast. Now, dare one say it, lesser podcasts would do emergency episodes about a new prime minister or a change of government or a ministerial resignation. But we're recording an emergency podcast because a 30-year-old play has returned to BBC iPlayer. So the absence of war has returned to BBC iPlayer. So we're using this opportunity to revisit David Hare's play about a Labour leader who has to listen to so much conflicting advice from his myriad advisors. So just give us a minute to pen our memo to Andy Burnham, and then we'll turn to the play. So, John, several months ago, I think before we probably even recorded an episode of this podcast, several glasses of wine into an evening, I'm pretty sure I promised we would at some point record an episode about the absence of war with you. And this is something you have raved about, I have to say, for years. What is it that you liked about it so much?
There's so much around the absence of war that I just adore. Part of this is nostalgia. So I watched this first when it was transmitted back in 1995. Then I don't think it was available to watch for probably until it's just been released on the iPlayer just now. It's very redolent of the time when I was sort of like first getting active in Labour Party politics. I'd been through that traumatic experience of campaigning in the 92 election that we were going to win until we didn't win it. There's a lot in here around the tensions within the party about how we would try and win again. So it speaks to me of that era. I have to say, having rewatched it now, it also speaks to me in a different way, having been a Labour leader myself in local government, of some of the challenges around leadership. So it kind of speaks to me in a new way 30 odd years on. And I think the other thing is just John Thor, who I've adored as an actor in everything he ever did. And I think he's just absolutely superb in this.
Yeah, absolutely. This is the first time I'd seen it, despite the fact, as I say, John, that you've been going on about it for years. I think there was a version on YouTube, but I can't find it now. So I think it is just an iPlayer.
Yeah, I think there must have been, because I originally read the play. So I didn't see the play, which was in 1993. It was staged. It was sort of a bit like James Graham's This House. More recently, it was the political play for everyone interested in politics to go to see, except me. I failed to get to see it. So when the play came out as a book, I read that in the 1990s. I have watched it once before. I think there was a version therefore on YouTube, or maybe it had a brief outing on iPlayer, and then I watched it the second time for this. I guess the thing it particularly is worth bearing in mind is that timing, that the play in 93, the TV version in 95, so they are after Neil Kinnock's second election defeat in 1992, but before the first of Tony Blair's victories in 97. And in fact, it must have all been written before the death of John Smith. So before that big, we've got to completely overhaul the Labour Party moment under Blair, ditching Clause 4, etc. So it came out at a time where I think it was unclear how much Labour still had to further change. And also, as we'll doubtless get into, that question about had Labour changed too much or not enough.
And there's an interesting Michael Billington article in The Guardian, because, so it was, as you say, it was on TV in 95. Revival at Birmingham Rep of the trilogy, so it's part of a trilogy, was performed in 2003, like April, May 2003, which I imagine, again, is probably a very different time to see this play. So when the John Thor character, the leader we'll talk about, is talking about being tough and bold enough to go to war. Obviously, in 2003, that has a very different resonation with the audience. So it's very, very interesting how almost the reception of the play has changed.
It's a shame that the other two elements of the trilogy haven't been sort of revived and televised in the same way, I don't think, have they? Because one is about the judiciary and one is about the Church of England. And both of those feel like topics where some of the major causes of sort of debate and scandal and change in the 90s are probably still, as with this play, still quite relevant now. Maybe they're not quite as good. I don't know.
And yeah, let us know if you've seen them. I quite like the Michael Billington quote, which is, it goes back to basic Aristotelian tragic principles. Great to have Aristotle on the podcast. It's been a while. By showing us a good man destroyed by a mixture of personal and societal failings.
Careful now, we're getting into spoiler territory with a quote like that.
Oh, come on. We're going to have to spoil this, Mark. Aren't we?
Some people might not yet know the result of the 1992 election and be wanting to watch the election night broadcast, which, would have been very tense at the time. It would be, don't want to spoil that for someone watching it for the first time.
If the 1992 election result is a surprise for you, you're probably not going to enjoy this play as much as you ought. So watch the
18-year-old me is still rewatching that broadcast of that election and still hoping for a different result, but it never happens.
1 year they'll take Basildon.
Yeah. No, let me confess, of course, I have rewatched the 1992 election night several times. But actually, after David Amis was murdered, I did rewatch that clip because it felt like that was the moment of his sort of probably highest profile where he sort of epitomised the whole political moment. And actually, it reflected in some ways, I thought, really well on him because he was clearly overjoyed at winning, but happy about it. It was happy rather than angry or doing down. It was. There's that pure moment of joy with that huge grin on his face, which is a lovely way to remember him. Much of his politics, obviously, very much disagree with, but he was definitely a committed public servant, and who had a really tragic end. So it's fitting that there is something really nice and positive about him to remember, albeit for those of us, like probably all three of us, we also really hate the fact that he won.
Just a final reflection before we do the plot and go on to sort of more stuff at the play. We did Mr. Smith Goes to Washington a few weeks ago with Aidan Byrne, Mark. We talked a bit in that about how, again, that's a story of a decent person who doesn't feel they can tell the truth and are sort of brought down by darker forces and a bit of their own maybe personal things, but more sort of outside influence. And we said a few times in that about you could potentially frame that to have a much darker ending. And I feel like in one sense, The Absence of War feels a little bit like that. It almost felt like, with a bit of a twist, this is almost the darker side of the Mr. Smith Goes to Washington.
Yeah. I think
story.
A lot depends on when you're watching it, because, in the immediate aftermath of 1992, it's the darker story. 4 Labour general election defeats in a row. And, all of that talk about will Labour ever win again. By the time you get to post-97 and Blair's landslide, you get to the point, which I think Neil Kinnock has got to himself as well, of, well, he did a huge amount to change the Labour Party. It wasn't quite enough, but he clearly set the scene, prepared the ground for 3 Labour general election wins in a row, and so in a way it becomes a more optimistic. Oh, this person who valiantly tried didn't quite get far enough, but the next person got there. And then at the time it came out, though, we didn't know we didn't know if Labour would ever win again. Would they have a trio of election wins? And so I think at that moment it would have been a wonderfully ambiguous message. I don't know how you remember it, John, from the time.
I mean, that's absolutely spot on, Mark, and it actually really brought it back to me rewatching it after all these years. That kind of, you think about where it was broadcast. The broadcast version I saw was in 95. As you say, it was written before John Smith sadly passed away. But we were in that period. It was the early period of the Blair leadership, so he'd taken over the previous summer. We kind of look back on that now as if all of this was predestined, that Blair came in, there was, the abolition of Clause 4, and off we went, and victory was a certainty. Certainly when you sat in as a Labour Party activist at that time, none of that was a given. And I think we were absolutely traumatised by the 92 loss, which most of us had expected we were going to win, or at least emerge as the largest party. And so that real sense of will this party ever win an election again was really deep baked amongst us all. So, and that sense really comes out, I think, of the play, and certainly just brought back all those memories to me watching it again.
Do you remember the popularity of the "Don't Blame Me, I Voted Labour" badges in the aftermath of 92? Yes. And obviously you get a bit of that after every election, that sort of feeling, and also after the Brexit referendum of, pro-Europeans that are thinking, well, don't blame me of all of these problems, I didn't vote for it. 92 is the only election where I remember there was just that it was such a widespread, deeply held reaction by a group of people that you saw lots of that slogan on lots of t-shirts, badges, except there was something about just the hope and disappointment that was, I think, particularly bitter for Labour in that election, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And that sense of, all the heavy lifting that had been done to get us into an election winning position in 92. We'd had the traumas of the poll tax. We'd had the Tories turning in on themselves in the removing Thatcher and putting Major in. So that there was a real sense of this should be our time. Just personally, I mean, this was the first election I ever sort of campaigned in. It was the first election I ever cast a vote in. And I do remember going, because I was at the count in Birmingham in 92. And I remember going back to the post count victory celebration and just watching the results come in, thinking, I'm 18 years old. I'm never going to see a Labour government. I'm going to live my entire life under the Tories. How times change.
I suppose the other thing is that the folk memory of the 1992 win for the Conservatives carried on, and still that you saw a lot of it in the commentary around 2023, 2024, didn't you? That a lot of talk from the quote unquote sensible commentariat about how Rishi Sunak could pull off a 1992, despite the lack of any kind of empirical evidence that suggested anything of the sort, and also the fact that, again, there's been a lot of talk about how the Starmer administration didn't really prepare very much for government and spent a lot of time instead thinking about how they were going to win and get a big enough majority. And again, you sort of get the impression that's because they were haunted by the ghosts of 1992. In a sense, they didn't want to have that hubris happen to them. And so in that sense, I feel what happened in 92 is still quite big psychologically in both parties.
I think that's absolutely right, but I also think it shows the danger of trying to draw too many lessons from an election that was now nearly 35 years ago, and applying it to the society that we live in the 2020s. But perhaps that's a matter for debate in another podcast,
or a different item on the agenda. Yes, but traditional values in a modern setting. How old Labour of you, but. Old new Labour, maybe. I can't keep up anymore. I still need to give Mark my 7-hour lecture on Labour factions. But
how John Thor Labour of you, we should perhaps say.
Yeah.
Another faction. Yeah, we could get a pamphlet out. That's a good idea. Right. So just to quickly sort of set up the plots, The Absence of War is about Labour leader George Jones, a very confusing name for me because George Jones for me is a country and western singer who sung A Good Year for the Roses, amongst others. I have a feeling they're the only thing that the George Jones country singer and the fictional George Jones have in common is they both seem to have had quite a taste for whiskey. But the George Jones we're talking about at The Absence of War, he's Labour Party leader and he is trying to hold his party together in the midst of an election campaign while dealing with lots of different advice from his advisors. Next item on the agenda, All the President's Men, cast and crew. Right, we've talked about how brilliant John Thor is. Very first scene in this is John Thor wearing a cardigan, smoking a cigarette, watching the telly, and that's when I watched that and thought, it's going to be all right. This is going to be absolutely fine.
At the time, of course, he had just finished doing Inspector Morse. And obviously, he's a brilliant actor. Immediately you're not thinking he's Inspector Morse. Yeah, he is a complete. But I think for the audience, seeing, you immediately feel you're in the safe hands of somebody. And actually, you're in the safe hands of somebody where you expect some things to go wrong, but it all to come right in the end. So as it turns out, that makes the poignancy of the play, of the plot, all work all the better.
Nicholas Day plays Kendrick, the Prime Minister, who we have had on before as the podcast. He was John Mills in Brexit: The Uncivil War. Oliver Ford Davis. A lot of you might have seen his bottom because Oliver Ford Davis, who plays Oliver, one of the advisors. He's best known for being the Archbishop of Canterbury in Johnny English. A character called Linus Frank, who's played by Martin Jarvis and I feel like if they remade this play, say they remake it now about the Ed Miliband leadership coming into 2015, I feel like the Martin Jarvis character would be played by Mark Gatiss. There's a very similar sort of scenery chewing interview role, which I don't know about you both. It felt a lot to me like David Frost was who he was going for. And there's other advisors played by Claire Higgins and Barbara Lee Hunt, directed by Richard Hare. He went on to do Notes on a Scandal, the Kate Blanchett film. David Hare, he, as you say, this is part of a trilogy. He's done a few other political plays, which I dare say we should do. One of the things we're about to talk about is State of Play. And given how much I've enjoyed watching Bill Nighy in State of Play, maybe we should try and add one of the David Hare plays with Bill Nighy in onto the list somewhere. But he apparently shadowed Kinnock on the campaign trail in 1992.
I wonder what the play would have been like had Kinnock won the 92 election. It doesn't feel like a story with a happy ending like that quite works as a David Hare play. Yeah. Given that the other two plays in the trilogy, as I understand it, are very much critiques of the state of Britain. I'm not quite sure how a play around somebody who becomes prime minister would have worked, but one of the many consequences of David Amos winning in Basildon that we will never find out.
Is it a bit like the Fawlty Towers episode, The Germans, where you just need someone to kind of look at all this squabbling and all these kind of contradictory advisors and George Jones being driven slightly mad with them, and one of the Tory spads just need to shake their heads and go, however did they win? And that's kind of how the curtain falls.
Labour's loss was the theatre's gain. Just on some of the cast, and I do think it's a very, very strong cast. There's some really, really good, quite sympathetic performances. I think you feel instinctively sympathetic to particularly the cast of characters around George Jones. I was interested to see one of Mary, who is clearly based on Julie Hall, I think it was, who was Neil Kinnock's press secretary. Is played by Saskia Wickham, who then went on to be Claudia Seabrook in Our Friends in the North a couple of years later. She's the Tory MP who beats Nikki, one of the lead characters, in the run for a parliamentary seat. IMDb actually gave me this one. I knew nothing about it until I was looking it up. So Richard Pascoe, who plays the Shadow Chancellor, who I'm sure we'll come back to discussing shortly. He apparently played F.E. Smith in a 1983 TV movie called The Plot to Murder Lloyd George.
No.
So I don't know.
I wonder if we can find that in some. Yeah,
I don't know if the plot was Asquithians who are really still upset about December 1916 or something else. But there's a fact for you.
Given we're about to talk about a whole bunch of Labour Party factionalism, a good group of old-fashioned Liberal Party factionalism. From the 20s.
If you want proper factionalism, Asquith versus Lloyd George. I mean,
yeah, absolutely. Next item, Art of the Possible. Any similarities between this play and real events? I mean, hell yes.
Yes.
But also, I was quite surprised at how closely the parallels were. So I suppose, in a way, David Hare tries to trick you by... so obviously, Neil Kinnock, for those who aren't, is from Wales and very happily married. And I suppose George Jones is made a sort of Cockney living in a flat in a sort of bachelor pad, isn't he? So I suppose they're trying to make a little bit of a difference between the two characters, but mostly I was so surprised at how similar a lot of the parallels were.
It's stuffed full of references to real events. I think it's done very well. It made me think of Terry Pratchett rather than Umberto Eco, to try to rise to your cultured Aristotelian comment from earlier, Cory. By which I mean both Pratchett and Eco work in lots of very erudite references. There's much more enjoyment to be had from their fiction if you understand the references and understand the jokes and the satire and so on. But I think what Pratchett is much better at than Eco is writing things that are great fun, even if you don't know the reference. So like there's a brilliant pastiche of Zeno's Paradoxes in one of Terry Pratchett's books, which if you know nothing whatsoever about Zeno's Paradoxes, is still hilariously funny. Whilst with Umberto Eco, if you don't get the references, you're a bit more lost, I think, often. And I think what David Hare does really well in this, I mean, there's just so many things, even like the real detail of at one point when Kendrick looks at his watch when he shouldn't do. A deliberate echo, I'm sure, of H.W. Bush looking at his watch when he shouldn't have during a US presidential debate. The rumours of a poll putting Labour 6 points ahead, causing a run on the pound. Again, that's in almost exactly echoes a genuine mini crisis for the Tories in 1987, when there was one wobbly day, when there'd been one not so good poll, inaccurate rumours of another bad poll. Again and again. And I think in a couple of cases, you can see why he does it, because it sort of makes the plot work, makes the big story work, like the pastiche of the Sheffield rally that you get. That works really well. But he just throws in all of these other details that didn't need to be there in a way that I think is a really good sort of fan service at its best, because it's not distracting if you don't know the references. And if you do know the references, it gets your mind in gear thinking about politics and the issues more broadly.
That's right. It does it well, but wears it quite lightly, so you can engage with it just as a piece of drama without necessarily having that deep political or historical understanding. I mean, the other one that jumped out to me is right at the start, where there's the scene where Jones is going into the rally and stumbles on the stairs, which for those of us who remember what happened to Kinnock on the beach at Brighton,
Exactly.
Take the trip backwards and fully into the sea. There's a nod to that, and also it's quite a nice little play of he stumbles at the final hurdle. So there's a nice little visual analogy there as well.
The reference to being quite verbose in Parliament as well. So the idea that we've been, again, it's a conversation that Jones has with his shadow chancellor about, we're waiting for you to take the final blow. But then it doesn't happen, and there were a couple of times, weren't there, with Kinnock in the Commons, where
it was the Westland debate. I think that the Westland debate was the classic moment. Tory government in crisis. Michael Heseltine walked out of cabinet, another cabinet minister gone, and then Neil Kinnock flubs it. Although I hope he doesn't listen to our podcast, because I did hear somebody make that point to him in another podcast a while back, and he did not fully agree with that take on events.
In case Neil Kinnock is listening, I should probably stress, I'm pretty sure he hasn't lamped one of his advisors, as happens. Although, if Neil Kinnock had punched Peter Mandelson in the face, I feel like that actually the history of the Labour Party in the modern era might have been quite different and not.
You could have avoided a few challenges over the last couple of years. Yeah. Although I think there is a story about Neil Kinnock not punching one of his advisors. I think it's a story he tells himself about getting into a fracas at the 1981 Labour Party conference, where I think he was assailed by one of the hard left delegates and responded in true rugby fan style.
I'm guessing everyone at the 1981 Labour conference was involved in some sort of fist fight.
I'm guessing so.
That's the impression I get. There's an idea in the play that Labour don't show loyalty to their leader, and whilst the Tories don't criticise theirs. I imagine when this came on telly in 1995, that probably felt a bit strange. Now feels less than accurate, maybe, around the internal discipline of the Conservative Party. I do like the fact a Labour Party, knowing that it's going to inherit a dire economic situation if it wins the election, and refusing to spell out what tax rises it might put in place to solve the problem. I mean, that would never happen now.
No, absolutely not.
Just at the end of the play, you have George Jones saying his advisors they should join the Tory party and mess it up, which I'm guessing, Mark, is what Liz Truss did, actually.
Exactly. It was the secret plan revealed accidentally by David Hare on national TV a couple of decades too early.
They should have been watching the BBC, shouldn't they?
I also reluctantly have to concede that the jibes at opinion polls in this are justified. So 1992 had been the most one of the biggest polling disasters, one of the biggest polling misses for pollsters in the UK. The sort of 1917, 1992 are the sort of, and 2015 are the trio of big polling disasters. So obviously George Jones is absolutely wrong to say, why does anyone take any note of the polls? We don't trust them in this. One can maybe excuse that from a mid-90s view.
In terms of that, why the polls were wrong, is it worth maybe thinking about why is it the Tories won in 1992 as a sort of a bit of a sidebar? There's a bit of a talk in the play about how people won't vote Labour if their economic times are bad, and Tory people will vote Nurse for fear of something worse, which impression of the commentary since I think is probably slightly overstated, isn't it? I think it's difficult for the play to do this because Kendrick, the Prime Minister, as we'll talk about, isn't a very John Major-y figure. But possibly what was not kind of emphasised at the time was how John Major himself managed to change the Tory party to win in 92. So the fact that he's able to sort of excise the poll tax, put Michael Heseltine in charge of unravelling a lot of that. I know the Citizens' Charter is mocked now, but sort of moving left from Thatcher on public services. Although the Tories were able to win in the middle of a recession, I think there's so Alwyn Turner in his book on the 90s quotes a Gallup poll, one of those polls, Mark, that we know are notoriously unreliable, asking why is it that, what do you think's caused the recession? And apparently answers are split essentially between the worldwide economic recession and the Thatcher government. And only 4% of those surveyed blamed the Major government, even though, of course, John Major was the Chancellor in Thatcher's government. Are we kind of missing the story of actually, is the 92 election less about, it's not so much about the hubris at the Sheffield rally and a lot of the kind of folk explanation at the time. Is it more about, it's actually John Major's personal triumph and a sort of misreading of the polls? What do people think?
I mean, I think Kinnock's, I've heard him acknowledge this in interviews himself, that it felt a little bit like the fox was shot the moment that the Tories changed leader. He says that he literally got his staff together that evening and said, "Well, we'll drink to Thatcher going, but tomorrow we're now fighting a very, very different battle." I think that certainly did reset some of the public mood. But you can't escape the fact that there was still a lot of lingering distrust of Labour in the run-up to that 1992 election that was based on what had happened over the previous decade, the splits at the beginning of the 80s, the wrong turns around defence, the mistrust around economic management, which Labour hadn't successfully properly answered, I think, by 92. There may have been a circumstance where with real anger against and against the poll tax, anger against Thatcher, and a sense of general tiredness, an election might have looked different if it had been a Kinnock versus Thatcher contest. But I do think that's the extent to which there was still deep suspicion around Labour's economic competence would have still been a major factor, even if the leadership of the Tories hadn't changed. And that was certainly something that, recollecting 35 years ago, knocking doors, that came across as a theme quite a lot. I don't think you can kind of escape that. And
I think one of the reasons why the reaction to that fourth general election defeat in a row was, not just the teenage you, John, thinking, am I going to live, my whole life under Tory government? But, there was a book like Turning Japanese that came out shortly after the 92 election about whether Britain was turning into Japan, as in terms of a country where there's one party that will just always wins elections. Because after the 92 defeat and before Labour's 97 win, since 1945, there had only been one election that Labour had won with a clear majority, 1966. It sort of limped over the finishing line or got close enough to the finishing line in 64 and twice in 74, but there'd only been one. And so when you then lose again, you can see why part of people's reaction to the 92 loss, but also part of the explanation for it, is that there was something that Labour had just not managed to get right in a variety of different generations, different circumstances, different leaders about chiming with the British electorate. And that's partly why, Blair and Brown felt they had to change the Labour Party so radically. And I think that is a part of the story that the play doesn't really bring out, does it? We do get Labour infighting in this. We don't get that sense of, is Labour just a permanent failure that has to completely change? That isn't part of the play. And also, as you say, Cory, the other bit that isn't really part of this play is that, to what extent did actually the Tories win? Rather than it being Labour that lost, that it's the Tories won. But, nothing can cover everything. I think the play does a good, really superb job at zooming in on the bit of the story that it does do.
I mean, it is quite interesting on that point, Mark, that you haven't got a sort of a Blair or a Brown type character in amongst that mix. Actually, if you look at the politicians in there, they're fairly what you might call old Labour. The deputy leader, the shadow chancellor, and George Jones himself are all of that kind of traditional Labour mould, if you like. You haven't got a Blair or Brown equivalent sort of in the mix posing some of those questions.
Given that John Smith would have been leader, at the time, it wouldn't have been actually clear necessarily who they were. Obviously now it's obvious in hindsight, but 92, 93, would it have been clear that the future of Labour rests with people like Blair and Brown rather than, say, Brian Gould? I
mean, there was certainly a sense in the immediate aftermath of 92 that they were the rising stars. I think there was a piece, it might have been in the Times just after Smith was elected, saying an interview with Tony Blair, where the sort of subtext of it was, should they have skipped a generation and gone for Blair instead? So I think there was certainly in the mix at that point. I think the other interesting sort of similarity between this play and real events is there are a lot of rumoured tensions which I think have subsequently been surfaced between Neil Kinnock and John Smith. Clearly, this is one of the themes that emerges in the absence of war. I do wonder what David Hare perhaps had been witnessing or what conversations had been had if he was embedded in with the Kinnock team in and around 92.
Yes, which John Smith was the shadow chancellor for Neil Kinnock, so it very much mirrors what we see in that. But also there is that longer term story of Labour leaders having, or Labour prime ministers even having, uneasy relationships with their chancellor having to do lots of, as it were, non-Labour things.
Well, I mean, that wasn't an issue when the play was revived in 2003. I'm pretty sure relations with the Prime Minister and Chancellor were at an all-time high. They should probably have tried rating pub snacks. That might have helped. I think that's quite a good segue into the Phil Willis Award. Who's the most evil or Machiavellian character in this play? I've got 3 nominations.
Two of them are wrong. Can I just make that clear now?
Obviously,
2 of them are wrong.
Yeah. Well, obviously, I've not nominated the small child, Mark. So obviously, all of mine are
yeah, exactly. Clearly wrong. Full stop.
the desperate poor taste. But so Kendrick, the Prime Minister, as we've sort of said, he's not that John Major figure, is he? He's very much a patrician Tory out of central casting who just needs to have a monocle, sort of stroking a cat basically on a chair, doesn't he? I kind of get the impression he's meant to be the villain of the play, although he's got very little screen time.
Keen to big up his wife Carol, who he references repeatedly in that speech when he calls the election.
Who looks a lot like Theresa May, which was quite surprising. So Malcolm, the Shadow Chancellor, seems to be evidence he's a little bit disloyal, doesn't there? Given that he might have leaked some information quite damaging to the election campaign. Not quite sure if he's meant to be the villain. But again, I don't quite get the impression. In the play, he comes across as someone who tells George Jones the uncomfortable truths he maybe needs to hear. So I don't quite think we can give it to Malcolm, the Shadow Chancellor. Or maybe Linus Frank, the kind of Ole Agnes interviewer, played by Martin Jarvis, trying to basically wind George Jones up, does a car crash interview with him, then tries to be his mate afterwards. Get the impression that maybe he's meant to be the villain of the piece.
Actually, I think all 3 are wrong. I've upped my score from 2 to 3 wrong. Sorry,
but I can't believe my explanation was that bad. That you went in convinced, and now, blimey, the Theresa May 2017. Shall
I rehabilitate all 3 before giving you a 4?
Yeah, do.
I mean, Kendrick, the Tory Prime Minister, is a Tory Prime Minister. There's nothing dodgy or underhand that he does in this play. Phil Willis's aren't what they used to be if he's in the Phil Willis category these days. Likewise, the Shadow Chancellor. I think the tensions that we see, in a way, are meant to replicate genuine tensions that there were. But I don't think Malcolm leaked the tax raising plans to the media, because that would be a really weird thing for a Shadow Chancellor who is probably desperate to try to find enough money to pay for all the promises all of his colleagues want to make, to sink one of the few tax-raising measures that he's got. That's weird. I don't think Malcolm leaked it. Likewise, I think Linus Frank, I mean, he is a bit of an unpleasant interviewer, but I just feel he's actually, I think, the one case where I think, I guess David Hare has some quite traditional left-wing views of the media. It does feel a little bit like almost a sort of straw man of unpleasant media. I think that's the one character that doesn't quite ring true for me. So I think the real Machiavellian, who is so Machiavellian that we don't know who they are, is whoever actually did leak the tax-raising secret plans to the media to sink them. And I don't think that would have been the Shadow Chancellor, because that's the Shadow Chancellor shooting themselves in the foot.
They refer to the wooden tops at HQ, don't they? Maybe it was one of the wooden tops took offence at being described to us and went to the media. Of those 3 characters, I mean, Kendrick always feels in what is a set of very well-defined characters, I think, in this play, Kendrick feels the one that's most like a cipher in some ways. Perhaps that's because he has sort of only a passing sort of role in the play itself, but very much an identikit patrician Tory with not a lot bit beneath that. Malcolm, now this is because I'm just massively invested in the George Jones character. So Malcolm, I'm very annoyed with. One, because I can imagine him perhaps being a little bit indiscreet over lunch without deliberately leaking things. I think it's fascinating sort of synthesis of genuine Labour politicians as well. You can spot a bit of Roy Jenkins in there. There's probably a bit of Roy Hattersley. There's a bit of Tony Crossland in terms of that patrician accent as well that kind of comes across. But also I think there's that scene where he's basically confronted by George Jones in the factory. There's a sympathetic edge that comes out of Malcolm as well, where he's telling some harsh truths to Jones. But yeah, you can't sort of just paint him as a Machiavellian villain in that way, because I think he's doing what a responsible politician probably needs to do in those circumstances. I mean, I came down ultimately on the Linus being the villain of the piece, not for the kind of cartoonish reasons of terrible interviewer undermining a left-wing leader. I think I just love the oily glee that Martin Jarvis plays him with. It's just it's just such a smooth, oily performance by him, and it's that little bit of name dropping about the Queen and the diet that's just yeah, it's just makes me take absolutely against him.
I can imagine the leak just being a bit of an inadvertent.
You're
over lunch.
determined to smear Malcolm, aren't you, Cory?
I think, but I'm more a cock-up than conspiracy kind of guy. I can absolutely see that it's something that comes out in a lunch.
I mean, my personal experience of things like this is it's always cock up and over conspiracy every time.
Because I don't think it's a chance to deliberately undermine the election campaign. It just comes across like that because this is the Labour Party.
I mean, the irony is in the real world 92 election, that it was that we actually had a shadow budget, which looking back on it was probably not the wisest of moves because it completely opened up the tax bombshell campaign and everything the Tories then bombarded us with.
I suppose, actually, because it wasn't a leak, was it? It was fully out in the open. Yeah.
It was press released. Press conference.
That's how you properly leak something at a press conference. Barack Obama's tan suit, best and worst bits of political detail. I found the whole film being a bit perturbed about the Labour logo that's used because they don't use a proper Labour logo. It took me the entire film. It's because they've used an arrow and it looks suspiciously like the Reform logo. It's not a very good logo.
Yeah. Also, the font that's used on the backdrop to the press conferences and the rally stage as well. I always think that these things always never quite work in political dramas. It's the one thing that they never seem to get quite right. It's a bit like, how in dramas where they can't mention Google, so they have to invent an alternative search engine, you find a spider or something like that, and they never quite seem authentic. And that all of the Labour branding stuff just felt a bit meh.
Could they not just use a Labour logo? Like, is there a rights there? I wasn't sure if there's just a fair usage or can't they just use a Labour logo? Would that have been seen as like breaking political neutrality on the BBC? I don't know if there's a reason they didn't use it.
Interestingly, and one thing that we might want to look at some point, Bill Brand, which is the other series that I bang on about endlessly in my nerdy obsession with Labour-based political dramas. In the first episode of that, which is the by-election that takes place, they literally use stuff that was used in genuine Labour campaigns. So the post, some of those posters we were still using in 1992, the same.
Suddenly Labour's election defeat seems a bit more explicable.
Yeah. Obviously the posters didn't have Vote Bill Brand on them. That would have been really weird and would have upset Jeff Rooker quite a lot. But
I think one of the sets of detail it gets absolutely right are the things that are very much of the time. It's quite fun seeing a Prime Minister do a Downing Street election announcement without a lectern, back how it used to be, back the proper day. I also think the way that the election gets called and all the senior Labour figures convene for scrambled eggs at their leader's flat in London is a little bit contrived for the purpose of the drama, but also does reflect how this idea that the election's called, therefore you fly off to do a quick visit to Scotland, Wales, England, 3 different marginal seats, whatever. That's all a relatively new phenomena. Particularly William Hague in 2001 really upped the ante on how quickly the opposition leader gets into the flurry of those activities. So that's definitely a reminder of an old world, as is the wonderful line when they're all trying not to panic and shouting very loudly to ensure that you're not panicking in the Labour leader's office when the election has suddenly been called, or rather when the Prime Minister's on the way to Buckingham Palace to call the election. How did we not know this was going to... And somebody said, we weren't watching CFAX, which is exactly how you used to keep on top of breaking news.
Oh, happy days.
Happy days.
I'm guessing in your office, John, you and your advisors were glued to CFAX all the time, right? In the council.
Made lots of news. I do love the campaign montage.
Yeah.
Again, this is me doing the John Thorpe fanboy stuff, but I think this just looks really good. He looks like a authentic political leader.
Yeah.
Out on the stump. That's very good.
And it's the opposite of the point you were just making earlier, John, isn't it? Because not often those montages as well look unrealistic in these things. Yet here, they absolutely. I don't know what it is about whether it's the film stock that they use or something, but there's something about it that just looks right and believable, isn't there?
Really, really good photo of John Thor in a hard hat as well, which is a nice callback to George Osborne on the podcast.
There's one touch which is, I guess, slightly easy to miss because it's underplayed a little bit, but the way that, which reflects what happens in reality, is the way that when the election gets called, an extra police bodyguard turns up, and then when it's clear that he's lost, the police bodyguard departs. That sort of that coming and going of extra protection is one of the sort of it must at some occasions be quite moving for the defeated leader, because you've got that sense of, I'm so important now, I'm needing extra protection, and then, okay, that's not happened in my life. It's done in quite a low-key way, but done quite powerfully. I also like the little bit where they're discussing the Labour War Book for the election and the instruction to use the word fairness rather than equality, which again I think reflects what Labour were genuinely doing as part of their modernisation, of trying to use researching quite carefully the right words to use to attempt to sort of hit the right note with the public. And if I remember rightly, fairness rather than equality was one of the switches that Labour politicians actually made, didn't they, John?
And I think that line is a direct lift. Somebody within the leaders' team at that time said that to candidates. I forget who it was, but that is definitely a line that's directly lifted from real life. I mean, just to a couple of bits that don't quite work as well for me. One is, I struggle to believe that a team would be quite that disorganized when your leader's going in for a major, make or break media interview. Dramatically, it works very well, but I just couldn't quite see the leader of the opposition turning up last minute, forgetting to have a conversation about the cue cards, and then just going straight into a media interview that big. That didn't a dramatic license, I think, is playing a bit there. The other bit was right at the end, where Kendrick comes out and declares an election victory with his blue rosette on out of number 10 rather than at what would have been CCHQ, which I don't think is technically how these things should be done.
It's a bit like with Brexit, the uncivil war, isn't it, where they have a very unrealistic depiction of how the referendum result was announced.
Yeah, it's an interesting point about the media interview, because I wasn't sure how much that was a reflection of the time, and so I wasn't sure if it was more a reflection of the relative unimportance they put on those sort of things, and also I guess the impression you get of George Jones' office is partly it's all a bit disorganized, it's all a bit, we've put in 28 things that all last half an hour, but the day only is 9 hours long. And I wasn't sure how much of it is a reflection of that, but also I wasn't sure of how much reflection is, well, he hasn't looked at the cue cards because he doesn't really want to use them, because he doesn't want to be managed in that way. And so how much is it a deliberate, I don't really want to prepare for this interview because all Oliver's going to make me do is say a bunch of things I don't really believe. I wasn't sure.
And I wonder also, I mean, I can certainly think of some politicians who I'm going to refer to in the vaguest possible ways, about whom people think that they have never had a well-organised team because they prefer the disorganisation and the chaos because it means they can do what they want. And so I wonder if there is a little bit of that's what's going on, or that, does George Jones does he want a well-organised team that is tightly managing him?
I mean, I don't know whether this was just triggering my, post leadership trauma of, I was watching that thinking I'd put more preparation in to do 5 minutes on Radio WM than George appears to have done for a major BBC interview.
At least that Kath Dan probably isn't talking about the Queen's diet or the King's diet when you're doing those interviews beforehand. Next item, very British coup. Any conspiracy theories in this film? Well, I mean, Mark's already invented a mysterious leaker. So we have our own special podcast conspiracy theory about this drama. That's very exciting.
A sequel based on the hunt for the mysterious leaker.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, there are no leakers. It's like the witch hunt of...
There is also the more conventional sort of government conspiracy, pre-Independent Bank of England, pre-OBR, of basically the government fiddling the economic figures and forecasts. I think what's presented in this is quite plausible. That's partly why things like the independence of the Bank of England happened, why the OBR was created. So it's a bit of a sort of mainstream, well-worn conspiracy, but it is a bit of a conspiracy nonetheless that governments used to get up to. Bit of a boring answer, sorry.
No, I think we've had the exciting answer, and the only other note I've got on here is about mortgage tax relief, which isn't necessarily going to raise the pulses of any listeners. How posh a lunch do you think you'd have to be given before you spilled your party's secret plan to govern after an election to a journalist?
Well, you see, the thing I don't understand about posh lunches being used as the way to extract information from politicians, the inadvertent saying a bit too much, is that in my experience, the skill that the really good journalist has is just to stay silent. And if you're having lunch and the journalist is staying silent, you can eat some food. And so you've got something to stop you saying something when you shouldn't. If the journalist is trying to lure you into saying something by saying nothing themselves, you want nothing to distract. You don't want to have an extra spoonful of mashed potato that you can take to sort of see yourself through it. So I don't know, John, you must have quite a lot of experience of journalists wanting to tease more out of you than you wanted to say. It's the silence that, you want I've got the cup of coffee, I can take a sip of coffee and carry on looking at the journalist, don't you? You want the props to distract.
Absolutely. I mean, this is the thing. I'm going to get a Harold Wilson reference in here because it wouldn't be me if I didn't do this. And that was the classic thing he used to do in TV interviews, was start packing the pipe and lighting himself time to think. I mean, it would have to be a very, very good lunch, I think, for me to want to disclose any secrets whatsoever. So anybody who wants to buy me lunch is listening in. I'm now free for lunch more than I was.
I guess it's the alcohol, isn't it? And particularly at the time, alcohol would have been much more common at lunchtime, even for professional working lunches. Alcohol would have been a very normal thing for a journalist and a politician to drink.
Not that I've had any secret meetings with journalists, but as a massive fan of both Roy Jenkins and Tony Crosland, if someone wants to buy me a lunch with a considerable amount of claret, that's absolutely fine. But my impression is you probably don't have that revelation over the main course and the mashed potato. Again, maybe this is my feeling from watching too many dramas, but does it happen, over the port and cigars afterwards? Once you've had the meal, you're on to the sort of
least, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. You're onto the brandy, so you're not only more lubricated, but there's that sense of a bit of a sense of obligation. Well, I've just had this lunch, and therefore, almost it's the unspoken thing you have to disclose something. But I don't really know if that's actually how it works, or if that's just something that I've kind of, because I've had from watching a lot of TV dramas where it's kind of implied those things happen.
So if any journalist is listening, basically Cory would quite like to be able to, put this theory to the test.
Yeah, it's a shame we don't have any secrets to spill, really. But speaking of secret plans, how to win an election, best and worst bits of political advice and strategy. I mean, blimey, the whole play is political advice and strategy.
I think people can take very different lessons from this because, it is at that moment when it's a matter of real debate. Is the problem that Labour has changed too much or not enough? And I think David Hare's view at the time was more in the Labour has changed too much camp. But it's, I think, a mark of how good a drama it is that you could definitely take either conclusion away from this, couldn't you? Which is unusual. I don't think we've done anything on this podcast so far where there are really two just such diametrically opposite conclusions waiting there for you to pick between.
I feel like a lot of the lessons that this play has, and the import it has from the advisors about the kind of language that Labour should be using, about the sort of policies it has, about how the Labour, even about what the issues they should talk about. So this idea that Labour shouldn't talk about the economy because that's a Tory issue. And that's a definite echo to a thing that's in the West Wing, isn't there? There's one of the consultants Bartlett brings in for his re-election campaign that talks about whether there are Democrat issues and the Democrats can talk about them and the Republicans can't, and vice versa. And I feel like so many of the advisors that won the 97 election for New Labour and that also won in 2024 have, I feel like, taken these issues to heart. But I wonder if they've been slightly overlearned. And that maybe, as I sort of try to hint with my sort of discussion of John Major earlier, is the real lesson maybe that oppositions don't win elections and that governments lose them. And actually, I know it's counterfactuals or unhistorical rubbish, as E.P. Thompson said. But actually, probably after Black Wednesday, an old Labour Party under John Smith would have won in 97, just as a Labour Party led by someone like Rebecca Long Bailey would probably have won in 2024. Probably. Because essentially the Tories had just blown themselves up by
You are desperately trying to get some audience correspondence coming in.
I know, yeah, I realise I've sort of slightly changed my mind on this slightly over the past couple of years.
He's doing a lot of heavy lifting.
Yeah, a lot of. I mean, my goodness, he is Mr. Iron Man with the amount of heavy lifting he's put into that. I think the John Smith one, I think, is the better half of your argument. And I think it's still an open question because of John Smith's tragic early death. Was putting a really reassuring face on the state of Labour Party as it was, with a little bit of further modernisation enough? Or, clearly when Blair took over, his view was no, it wasn't enough, that he needed to go further. But as you say, perhaps with the ERM debacle, the Tory sort of reputation for economic competence in tatters, perhaps John Smith would have won. There's a whole other course of British political history. We'll never know if it would have happened or not. But that's what I really like about something like this, is it gets you thinking about those sorts of broader issues, and it does it in a way that doesn't feel like the playwright is trying to shoehorn you into only one viewpoint, even though I think I can figure out where his sympathies, at least at the time, were as between those different viewpoints.
Yeah, I think his diagnosis isn't quite correct. I err more towards there's a lot of baggage that was still holding Labour back in 92. Some of that was just general public perception and lack of confidence, as I say, in our ability to run the economy. And I think that if that's the subtext of Hare's play seems to be, it's because George has abandoned what were supposed to be deeply held principles and now no longer knows what he believes. I'm not sure that works as the diagnosis of why Labour lost, certainly in real life in 92, or indeed in this play. I do think that there is, as you say, Cory, you can overlearn the lessons of 92. The world of 2024 was a very different world to the world of 1992. I mean, if you just think about people, the allegiance of electors to parties is entirely different. In 1992, there was a core Labour vote and a core Conservative vote, and it was all about who moved around in the middle, and allegiances didn't shift that quickly. We're now in a completely different world where it's far more consumerist, and people will happily switch between various parties quite easily. And I think that's something that, if we're trying to learn lessons from 92 and applying them to now, that's where the thing starts to break down. I am actually in the camp that I think Smith would have won in 97, but it wouldn't have been on the scale that Blair did.
And I think at the heart of this is that comment from George Jones where he says, you can't say what you think. And in the drama, it's presented that sense that you can't say what you think is what's leading Labour to defeat in this fictional election. But I think you can read it the other way, and maybe this partly reflects the fact that my politics is, more different from that in the drama than perhaps both of yours. But you can read that as just a really self-indulgent. No, of course you need to pick your words with care. The more important something is, the more important it is to pick your words with care, to work out what is the thing that you might say that's going to be most effective at influencing people. That's part of the onus of being a leader, is not that you just self-indulgently throw out words without pre-thought. So I think at the heart of that, there is that sort of sense of, which I think was part of the genuine debate at the time in Labour and in other forms since as well, of it is that picking your words carefully, being very selective in what issues you decide to push. Is that sort of responsible seriousness, or is that sort of nasty cynicism? And I think that phrase, you can't say what you think, is nicely counterposed in this drama with, at the end, where George Jones absolutely goes for, I'm not going to say what I think, when he basically says, I'm going to be loyal to my successor. I'm not going to go around saying what I really think about them. And I don't think David Hare really pulls out the contrast between those two that clearly. So I don't know if he deliberately intended you to see it as that switch from view at one point to view at the end, or whether that's just me because of my own personal view about the view earlier on, particularly being eager to spot. You see, I was right all along. Even you're saying it now, George.
No, I think that's a really good reading of it. And I'm not sure whether it's intentionally in there or not. I mean, one of the things that really jumps out on me about this play, having watched it more recently, is I think it's really good on pulling out the dilemmas around that face political leaders.
Yeah, absolutely.
Back in 1995, I don't think I'd have understood that. Having spent 3 years leading Birmingham and reflecting on that now, there's an awful lot that sort of jumps out at me. I mean, just some of the things that Jones says earlier in the play. So, you know, a politician can only deal with his inheritance. Well, I think I know a fair bit. That speaks to me. There's no endeavour more difficult than getting people to abandon their dreams. Yeah, that feels a bit on the nose as well. And my particular favourite was the one that said to him about, "Oh God, I hope I don't drop a bollock tonight." I mean, I think we've all been there as well. But I think it is very good at pulling out that sort of dilemma between what you as an individual believe and the things that drive you into political life in the first place, but also that responsibility that you then carry if you're in a position of leadership. And frankly, you know, sometimes you can't say stuff that you would necessarily want to say because you've got a wider responsibility to the party that you're leading, or frankly there's stuff that if you say it as a leader, it creates a whole set of political consequences that completely undermine what it is you're seeking to achieve more widely. I think it's very good at pulling out some of that, even if I don't think necessarily that's what David Hare's trying to pull out the play that he's written, but it's definitely there.
It's that kind of mixture of the attitude of someone who obviously, who said, you know, this the Labour Party is the best vehicle for social justice we've ever had. The fact that you've got all the advisors around his house having scrambled eggs on the election campaign. This isn't just about personal. This isn't just about a sort of political work relationships. These are the advisors. You get the impression are quite good personal friends of his. You know, we've mentioned the fact there's a physical altercation. The fact that doesn't seem to get leaked during the campaign. The fact he says this isn't even going in your memoirs. You would be surprised if that came out until after he died. It's the weird sort of duality of being part of an organisation which you know is kind of neat, that you feel is a necessary vehicle for social progress. You're surrounded by people who are essentially a bit of a surrogate family. But you're also sort of at the same time thinking, this organisation is a massive hot mess. And how are we ever going to make it function in a way that it can work as an organisation? And you kind of feel like that's what he's trying to kind of wrestle with as well. It's more about how, and that's why he doesn't want to say anything about his successor. It's trying to keep the show on the road, and it's not just about himself personally. He's trying to wrestle with how can we get this institution, which often can kind of career off the road. How can we try and keep it where we want it to go?
Yeah,
very Neil Kinnock of you.
Is there something about the politics of having changed your mind and how to show you changing your mind? So again, Alwyn Turner kind of quotes Peter Shaw on Kinnock, saying he didn't really make a public attempt to explain why he changed his mind on various policies. And this is something you get out of the TV interview that Linus Frank does with George Jones, is this idea of him changing his mind, but he hasn't really explained why. Thinking about that and about Kinnock's journey, which I think was a really difficult one for him to have on issues like Europe and nuclear disarmament. And also thinking about, say, Keir Starmer and his government over the two-child benefit cap, where the government went from saying we're not going to get rid of the benefit cap to suspending MPs for voting for the benefit cap, to removing the benefit cap and hailing it as one of the great achievements of the Labour government so far. Or even, say, the attitude of Kemi Badenoch on net zero, where the Tories were the ones who brought in the guidelines on Britain being net zero by 2030. Badenoch's defended that as a minister in government, but is now trying to unpick that. But she's not really explaining why she's doing that or how she's changed her mind, or regardless of the fact that a net zero is an issue that does resonate with a key chunk of the current Conservative vote that they have, such as it is. There is a lesson, I think, here on it's okay for politicians to change their mind if they can sort of explain how they're doing it and why they're doing it, perhaps.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think, I mean, obviously, one thing that makes it a lot easier, say, for Blair to say we're changing is because when you come in new, you can say, look, just sadly, my party has not been successful, therefore we need to change. That a new leader coming in, it's a much easier pitch than some, and even for John Major as well.
Mm.
Although it's slightly trickier because he has to keep Thatcherites on board and so on. But that sense of something went horribly wrong. I've come in. I'm dropping that poll tax policy. I'm not Mrs. Thatcher. You can illustrate that you are wanting to do things differently and that you recognise there are some things that went wrong. That yes, in a way, Neil Kinnock, I guess partly because it was such a long battle to change the Labour Party, doesn't quite have that clear cut through. This is why I'm changing, sort of, well, this is why I've seen the light and decided we need to change moment, does he? It's a much longer incremental struggle.
Could you argue the militant speech in 85 is sort of that?
Yeah, although is that not also in the tradition of Labour leaders, not of the left, taking on the left in the Labour Party? I mean, it's a brilliant speech, dramatic moment, definitely, but I'm not sure that's really symbolises change as in the way that we've been talking about, at least. But I don't know, maybe. What did you think of it at the time, John?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a bit too young to have remembered the full impact of the militant speech.
Second World War.
Yeah, that was 85, wasn't it? But I think what I picked up sort of subsequent to that was, that kind of drew attention. It was absolutely necessary and right thing to do, and it is a superb piece of speech making. But it kind of also drew attention to the fact that this was a party that was very, very badly divided, and also contained some people of questionable opinions, and we were having to focus on removing them rather than setting out a prospectus to take the country forward. And I think that was something that always hampered Kinnock's leadership, sadly. I mean, I think there are great things to be written about the service that Neil Kinnock did for the Labour Party. I think he's a great hero of the movement, frankly, in terms of saving the party and putting it back on a path to government. But I think in doing so, he just had to burn through a lot of political capital and take a lot of political damage. And by the time you got to 1992, and I mean, as he himself has said in interviews, he was kind of old news by then as well. He'd been leader for 9 years. The Tories had put a fresh face on top of the package. You've got all of the stuff around the doubts that people still had about Labour's ability to run the economy and to run an effective government, and all of that came together, I think, just to sink him. And I think that's interesting in the context of the absence of war. Clearly, George Jones has been leader probably for about the same amount of time that Kinnock had been in real life, and I think again, that thing in the Linus interview was almost teasing that out. George has had to take some different positions to those that necessarily brought him into the leadership in the first place in order to change the party.
I think there's an interesting bit about whether you stick or twist in election campaigns. So they've got the book about what they're going to say on which particular day, and then there's a bit halfway through, maybe a bit more than halfway through the play, in which they say, actually, is this working? Do we have to shake it up a bit? And I think that's always an interesting. I mean, what it made me think of was 2017, when it's pretty obvious the strong and stable campaign isn't really working. The much better example, I suppose you had, Mark, was 2005, where they realised they've got to bring Gordon Brown in to sort of anchor the election campaign. But it does make me think like the Prime Minister, when the Prime Minister, and as you said, John, I guess Kendrick's a bit of a cipher. It's maybe a bit unfair to focus on what he says, given it's all a little bit flimsy. But he says, I'm calling a snap election, number one, to end uncertainty, and number two, to kill off the Labour Party. And I can't help feeling that's a bit of a flimsy premise on which to have an election campaign. And that maybe if you had a bit of a more agile political argument, you could maybe say, hang on, why is the PM call, everyone knows PMs promises call elections when they think they can win, but they usually try and couch it in slightly more elevated terms, perhaps. I'm pretty sure Hare Wilson in 1966 didn't say, well, we all know Ted Heath's a bit rubbish, so I'm going to call an election now and get a bigger majority. Polls look good. So I do wonder if, you had a bit more of a fleet. I realise I'm now contradicting everything I said about how a Tory win in 92 is all down the triumph of John Major and all that kind of stuff, and I'm contradicting myself wildly in this episode. But I wonder if there's a little bit of a more supple election narrative would have been to maybe challenge that. And instead, what one of George Jones's top advisors is doing is saying, "Oh, well, if you just followed my advice, I'd have won." Oh, thanks.
Yeah, it's clearly just a plot device that doesn't quite work in terms of how the election is called. Um, you kind of you into this like counterfactual stuff here, but there's a bit the whole thing around there. They're very deliberately avoiding talking about the economy as well, where it's quite clear that there is a fundamental weakness around the economy, which gets referred to in the closing statement that Kendrick makes. And you're kind of looking at that going, isn't that the bruise they should have been punching a bit harder rather than talking about health 4 days out of 5?
But isn't that the classic Labour election dilemma? Is if you're not trusted on the economy, but the economy matters hugely to people, do you talk about the big issue, or are you shooting yourselves in the foot? And do you instead need to revert to talking about the NHS, on which you've got the position that is much more widely supported by the public?
Yeah. I mean, I think the history shows that if we can't sound vaguely credible on the economy, there's only ever one result to an election.
Moving on then, Zeitgeist tape.
Yes.
Right. As standing orders dictate, John, in this section, Mark starts by talking about a door.
So what really excited me about the Downing Street door in this drama is it gets something right that State of Play gets wrong. So the door at 10 Downing Street is just this really obvious political symbol. You know, Downing Street door, Big Ben, those are the two things that get you, oh yes, this is about British politics. And this door has the mud scrapers to scrape the mud off your feet. It has those next to the door in the way that they're missing in the door in State of Play. So well done to whoever did the stage set that they used for this. I suspect, particularly given at the time that this was done, that it would have been a standard bit of prop that got reused for several different things. But whoever it was originally who did that, or maybe they did it fresh for this, well done. You got the mud scrapers in there. The door looks as it should do. The other thing that, again, this gets right, which several other dramas we've talked about, most notoriously The Iron Lady, don't, is the scenes in the Commons look pretty good. They get how MPs are sat all a bit jiggledy-piggledy, and so they're not all lined up in neat, evenly spaced rows. And the fact that it's a sea of white male faces, you know, accurate for the time, at least. It's not quite raucous enough, I think, but overall, that's pretty good. The thing, though, that is really good are the corridors. The corridor, didn't recognise where they filmed them, because Manchester Town Hall and the National Liberal Club are often used for the interiors of Parliament, etc. I don't think it's either of those, but the corridors look so close to being right.
It is Manchester Town Hall.
Oh, is it Manchester Town Hall? Yeah. It's a different bit of Manchester Town Hall from the bit that we usually see in political dramas.
This completely offends my Brummie sensibilities, but I want to give a bit of a shout out to Manchester Town Hall. As you say, features a lot in these kind of productions. But the bit that really is striking is, I think that courtyard in Manchester Town Hall must be the most filmed courtyard in the history of drama, because it's the bit where George gets into his car to drive off, having left the office, but that's also the same courtyard that Matty Storring gets dropped into in House of Cards. I think it also appears in Finest Hour, the film. So he pops up in there as Churchill. And also, for anybody who remembers the 1980s Jeremy Brett Sherlock Holmes series, that appears, I think, in every other episode as a little bit of Victorian London. And eventually, I think Brett gets beaten up by some of Moriarty's goons in there. So it's a well-filmed place. And if you do go and visit Manchester Town Hall, they do proudly point out this is the bit that where Francis Urquhart threw Matty Storring off the roof. Yeah.
I wonder why those corridors don't get used more often, because the big sort of broad marbled corridor, sort of corridor spaces, they get used a lot. But the narrow corridors in this, which do look quite a lot like some of the real narrow corridors in the Palace of Westminster, I don't remember seeing them in any other drama.
Yeah, you're right about those smaller ones that do look. They are very redolent of the Palace of Westminster, aren't they?
Well, and this is going to make
Any
national news.
corridor
John,
chat you would like to add, Cory?
I just cannot believe that John, off the leash now, has gone in and praised Manchester over Birmingham. And it's good to see him falling in with our new Prime Minister so wholeheartedly.
Yeah, exactly. Nice bit of ingratiating there, John.
A good top shift there.
We're all Northerners now.
But I get, yeah, but you couldn't really, at the risk of having some niche Birmingham chat, you couldn't really use Birmingham Town Hall or Birmingham Council House to film this kind of drama. Like the glass corridor is nice, but in a kind of, it's quite a continentally way, isn't it?
I mean, the famous glass corridor that every time I was filmed in there, it looked like I was being interviewed from my very posh conservatory, which I don't actually have.
I think if you do an English language remake of Borgen, you could maybe use
Yes.
the council house. I have few less corridor chat. I've got the in George Jones's flat. There's a poster of Long Day's Journey into Night on the wall. But I do wonder if the fact that the play that George Jones is booked to see on the night of the elections, called the fact that that play is Hamlet, I feel is quite significant, given that a lot of this play is about a sort of indecisive leader, unsure what to do, a bit dithering, feels quite symbolic. We can finish this episode with a bit of a John Thor loving, because I think this is probably the best performance by an actor we've had on the podcast so far. So I say actor just in case, because Meryl Streep as Margaret Thatcher is excellent in The Iron Lady and saves the film. We've had a lot of really good scenery chewing performances. And next time, if you want your scenery chewing performance, we've got The Death of Stalin next week, in which Jeremy Isaacs eats the entirety of Moscow. So there's but I think in terms of like a really great acting performance that is incredibly believable, but goes up and down the gears from effervescence to despair to anger and back in a really believable way, in a way that you can completely understand why these advisors want him to win. You can completely understand why they want to have dinner with him, why there's this surrogate family, why they're so desperate for him to succeed and to prove himself. But there is also that underlying feeling that maybe Malcolm the Shadow Chancellor's right, and maybe he kind of knows he can't quite do it himself. It's a phenomenal performance. It really is. It's such a great performance.
I mean, I think you struggle to see anything that John Thor did where you go, that was a bit of an average performance. And he was just such a stunningly brilliant actor. As you say, recently had just come out of doing Inspector Morse, and yet just moves into this part sort of effortlessly. And you're literally there. He is George Jones, leader of the Labour Party. You're not thinking it's Inspector Morse cosplaying as a politician. I just think that it is the subtlety of the performance as well, and you almost get the set that bit around people doubting whether he's got what it takes, and you can almost sense that in him himself. Is that scene in the flat where he's asked, "Are you going to beat him?" And it's just the way that he goes, "Oh yes, I am," but it kind of, there's a beat that's missed where you can see the doubt, and it's just really, really beautifully subtle. I mean, it's just such a great performance, and the way that he's also able to ramp up the passionate side of his nature, the tub thumping speaker. I think that's beautiful, that bit where he's talking about how the words used to come from the air, and then you have that moment where he's reaching for words and they don't come. It's a superb performance.
Yes, that's heartbreaking, and at least it doesn't say "Hell yes, I'm tough enough." They're very different play.
All right.
Final item: state of play. John, you want to kick us off? Have you got a rating out of 650? Any reflections on watching this again 20, 30 years on?
I mean, I did wonder, having not seen it for 30 years, whether there'd be a bit of the memory cheats, and was it as good as I remember it being? And actually, it was a joy to see it again. It was every bit as good as I remember it being back in the May of '95. And as I say, there's bits in it now that I probably appreciate better, having been on a sort of political leadership journey of my own. So parts of that play speak to me in quite a personal way to an extent. So, I mean, I'm not going to say 650 out of 650, much as I love it. I think it's definitely a 550 for me. As you said, Thor is absolutely amazing in it, but also I think the rest of the cast are really incredibly strong. There's some beautiful, brilliant, subtle performances there that bring out the themes behind the play very powerfully. I think it's just quite a believable, credible portrait of what politics is like. It picks up on the dilemmas and the challenges of leadership really well, and there's a humanity of the key characters as well. They come, you can sympathise with them even if you don't necessarily agree with them. There's a warmth and a humanity and a vulnerability to the performances. So yeah, 550 for me, and it was an absolute joy to re-engage with this after so many years.
I hugely enjoyed it as well, for all the reasons you've rightly said, and as you say, John Thor's performance is superb. Although for me, the reaching the hand upwards and sort of no words metaphorically appearing, that was just a little bit hammy, but to me, but otherwise, superb performance by him. But I think, and it's also, I mean, we're going on to do the Let Bartlett Be Bartlett episode from the West Wing, which is sort of the West Wing equivalent of, you can't really say what you want. Oh no, I'm going to go and say what I really want. And it does this so much better than that Let Bartlett Be Bartlett episode. I think the latter seems a bit like it's in the Love Actually class, compared to the proper serious drama in this. But I do think fundamentally, and obviously this is said a little bit with the hindsight of having seen Labour then go on to win 3 general elections by taking a different course from the sort of the George Jones approach. I think it doesn't really engage quite enough with that. Is the problem that Labour hasn't changed enough, rather than is the problem that it's changed too much sort of question. So I've still very much enjoyed it, giving it quite a high score, but a bit lower, well, a fair degree lower than you, John. I think I'll give it a 450 out of 650. Corey, are you going to be the wishy-washy fence-sitting liberal of us by giving it a score somewhere between the two?
Absolutely, yes, I am.
Excellent.
Let's just first of all make sure that the chair Mark's disapprobation on Mark for saying that John Thor's performance was hammy, and that has been noted and will be used in evidence against you in future podcasts when commenting on acting performances in various shows. On the politics of this, as you can probably tell from this episode, I'm a bit all over the place like a shopping trolley on whether or not the diagnosis is right, and it's part of.
Does that make me the Dominic Cummings of this podcast, trying to desperately control you? I'm not sure what I feel about that.
I'm not sure. I think it's more.
Gonna walk out with a box full of stuff at the end.
Yeah.
As I drive up to Barnard Castle, listening to the rest of this politics, trying to think about the correct. I think part of it is trying to think about what has the past 2 years of Labour in government led to question my assumptions about how we got here and what was necessary and what wasn't. And I haven't quite made my mind up, as you can probably tell from this. So, but in terms of sheer political drama, I think it's a really great exploration to the Labour Party sort of now at the time. I think John Thor's performance is terrific. And even if you're not massively into politics, and if you're not massive into politics, well done for listening to this for about an hour. If you're not massive into political dramas, I think it's just worth watching for his performance. And it's on iPlayer. By the time this episode comes out, it'll be on iPlayer for about 2.5 more weeks. So you have got time to see it. And I might try and catch a few of the other Screen 2. So this is part of a series the BBC do called Screen 2. And we'll hopefully be doing one of them with another guest in a few months. So look out for that. Like you, Mark, I think it's a better exploration of political leadership than the Let Bartlett Be Bartlett episode, which we'll do in a week or so. So I've literally come halfway between the two of you on 500 out of 650.
How very Liberal Democrat of you, Corey.
Absolutely. Well, it's the Roy Jenkins part of me rather than the Tony Crosland part of my political personality. John, thank you so much.
Absolutely.
I'll wear Mark down and eventually we'll do an episode of Bill Brand.
I've seen Bill Brand. Really enjoyed it.
I've not seen it. Okay,
definitely. I'm up for that.
Right,
brilliant. Okay, well that's
we'll be back for Bill Brand in due course then. But thanks for having me on. It's been an absolute pleasure.
No, it's been great, John. Thank you. Is there anything you want to plug while you're on, or are you plug free?
I'm plug free.
Perfect. Okay.
Said with a degree of relaxation. All your worries behind you now, John. But listeners who do have many views about Cory's outrageous takes on Labour Party electoral history, do please go post up a comment or other feedback on our Substack, politicalfictions.substack.com. There's a post up there for every episode of this podcast. And we do love the feedback that we get and the emails as well. Particularly people have highlighted some other excellent shows that we might well try to fit into the schedule in future, as well as doing Bill Brand. So do go to politicalfictions.substack.com.
And as I've already trailed, next time in 1 week. So yeah, we've gone weekly, but only temporarily. We are looking at The Death of Stalin next week, the Armando Iannucci film, which is available on DVD or to stream wherever you would like to stream.
And not really a film you can avoid spoilers for, given its title.
Speak to you next week.